of a mafia boss who fell deeply in love with her. The car door flew open and she threw herself inside, blood running from her split lip and terror written across every inch of her face as she gasped, "Please, just drive, please get me out of here before he catches me." Marcus Sullivan looked at this woman who just crashed into his passenger seat like her life depended on it, saw the fresh bruises blooming purple across her cheekbone, and the way her hands shook so violently she could barely close the door behind her. His engine was already running, his hand on the gear shift ready to pull out of the restaurant parking lot. And now there was a bleeding waitress in his car, begging him to save her from someone. He could see a man bursting through the restaurant door 20 feet away, face twisted with rage and fists already clenched, shouting her name like a curse as he spotted Marcus's Mercedes. The waitress shrunk down in her seat, trying to make herself invisible, and whispered, "Please, please, please don't let him get me." And Marcus made a decision in the space of a heartbeat that would change absolutely everything. He hit the gas, and the Mercedes shot forward with the kind of acceleration that only German engineering and unlimited money could buy, leaving the raging man in the parking lot screaming threats that got smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. The waitress was sobbing now, hands covering her face, whole body shaking like she'd been holding herself together through sheer willpower, and it had finally run out. Marcus had been sitting in that restaurant for the past 45 minutes watching this woman work, noticing her in ways he hadn't noticed anyone in years, admiring the grace she maintained while carrying heavy trays and managing demanding customers. She had this way of smiling that made tired businessmen tip better and lonely old men feel seen. But Marcus had caught the moments between tables when her smile dropped and something haunted flickered across her features. Then that man had walked in with his friend, both of them loud and aggressive in a way that made the entire restaurant tense up, and Marcus had watched the waitress's face drain of color when she saw them. The man had called her over to his table with a snap of his fingers like she was a dog, and when she approached, he grabbed her wrist hard enough that Marcus could see her wince from across the room. The conversation had been ugly, the man's voice carrying across the restaurant as he called her names that made other diners look away in discomfort, as he threatened her in ways that were just vague enough to avoid intervention, but clear enough that everyone knew exactly what he meant. The waitress had tried to pull away, and the man had yanked her closer. His friend laughing like this was entertainment, like watching someone get terrorized was just another Tuesday afternoon. Marcus had felt rage building in his chest with every passing second, his hands clenched around his fork hard enough to bend the metal. But he had no reason to get involved, no connection to this woman that would justify him walking over and breaking that man's wrist the way he wanted to. So he'd finished his meal with ashes in his mouth, paid his bill, and walked out to his car thinking about how he was going to have someone look into who that man was and make his life quietly miserable. I'm trying to prove to my mom that I can reach a wide audience with these stories without ever leaving home. She thinks I'm wasting my time writing instead of getting a real job in your city. Let's show her these stories matter. You won't believe what the mafia boss does next. But then the universe had handed him exactly what he wanted, this woman throwing herself into his car and giving him every reason in the world to get involved. And Marcus Sullivan never wasted an opportunity. He drove fast through streets he knew better than his own reflection, taking turns that would lose anyone trying to follow, while the waitress gradually stopped sobbing and started breathing in ragged gasps that sounded like she was trying not to hyperventilate. Marcus asked her name without taking his eyes off the road, and she said Sarah, just Sarah, like giving him her full name would make this too real or too dangerous or too something she wasn't ready to face yet. He told her his name was Marcus, and that she was safe now, that nobody was going to hurt her while she was with him, and Sarah laughed bitterly through her tears, saying that's what everyone says until they meet Derek. Derek. So that was the name of the man currently losing his mind in a restaurant parking lot, and Marcus filed that information away for later use along with every detail he'd observed in the past hour. He asked Sarah where she wanted to go, and she just shook her head, saying she had nowhere, that Derek knew where she lived and worked and spent time, that there was literally no place in this city she could hide from him. Marcus made another decision that probably wasn't smart but felt inevitable, telling Sarah he was taking her to his place where Derek wouldn't be able to reach her, where she could clean up and figure out her next move, without looking over her shoulder every 5 seconds. Sarah protested weakly, saying she couldn't impose on a stranger, couldn't drag him into her mess. But Marcus cut her off by explaining very calmly that she'd stopped being a stranger the moment she got in his car, and that Derek had stopped being her problem the moment Marcus decided to make him his problem instead. There was something in Marcus's voice when he said that last part, something cold and absolute that made Sarah finally look at him properly instead of just seeing him as an escape route. She studied his profile as he drove, took in the expensive suit and the scarred knuckles, and the way he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never losing a fight. And Marcus could feel her reassessing who exactly she'd thrown herself at for rescue. She asked what he did for a living, and Marcus considered lying, but decided against it, told her he ran various businesses in the city, and left it at that, knowing she was smart enough to read between the lines. Sarah went very quiet for a long moment before asking if by businesses he meant the kind that operated outside legal boundaries. And Marcus said some of them yes, most of them actually, and did that change whether she wanted his help? Sarah laughed again, but this time it sounded less bitter and more hysterical. Said she'd just escaped her abusive ex-boyfriend by throwing herself into a mafia boss's car, and maybe her judgment had never been good to begin with. Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the word mafia boss said, so casually, like she'd already accepted what he was and decided it was better than what she was running from. And he supposed it said everything about how bad Derek must have been. They pulled up to Marcus's building, and Sarah stared at the luxury high-rise with something like despair on her face, realizing just how far out of her depth she was getting. Marcus came around and opened her door like a gentleman, which seemed absurd given the circumstances, but his mother had raised him with manners even if she hadn't managed to raise him legal. And Sarah took his offered hand because what choice did she have really? The doorman greeted Marcus by name, without even glancing at Sarah's disheveled appearance and split lip, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about the kind of building this was and the kind of residence it catered to. Marcus's apartment was on the top floor naturally, 30 stories above the streets where normal people lived and worked and got terrorized by men like Derek. And when he unlocked the door, Sarah stepped into a space that probably cost more than she'd earned in her entire lifetime. She stood in the entryway dripping blood onto his expensive hardwood floors and asked why he was helping her, what he wanted in return, because nobody did anything for free, especially not men with scarred knuckles and penthouse apartments. Marcus looked at this broken, bleeding woman who'd been conditioned to expect that kindness always came with a price, and he felt rage ignite in his chest all over again, directed at every man who'd ever taught her that lesson. He told her he wanted nothing except to see Derek's face when he realized Sarah wasn't coming back, that she'd found someone who scared him more than he'd ever scared her. And the way Sarah's eyes widened told Marcus she was starting to understand that this wasn't just about offering sanctuary. This was about Marcus declaring war on her behalf, about him making Derek a problem that would be solved permanently. And Sarah should have been terrified of that, but instead she just looked relieved. Marcus showed her to the guest bathroom and gave her clean clothes and told her to take her time, that they'd talk about Derek and what came next after she cleaned up and stopped shaking. Sarah disappeared into the bathroom, and Marcus heard the shower start. Heard her start crying again now that she was alone, and he pulled out his phone to make the calls that would end Derek's comfortable existence by morning. His second-in-command answered on the first ring, and Marcus gave him Derek's name and description and instructions to find out everything, where he lived and worked and spent money, who he knew and who he owed, and what leverage existed to destroy him. Marcus wanted a complete dossier by midnight and wanted surveillance on Derek starting immediately. Wanted to know if Derek tried to find Sarah or hurt anyone else while working through his rage. The shower turned off, and Marcus heard Sarah moving around in the bathroom, probably staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. He'd seen that look before on people who'd survived things that should have killed them, that disconnect between who they used to be and who trauma had turned them into, and he wondered how long Derek had been breaking Sarah down piece by piece. She emerged 20 minutes later wearing Marcus's shirt that hung to her knees and with her hair wet and tangled, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in the restaurant. The bruises stood out starkly against her clean skin, purple and yellow and green evidence of sustained abuse. and Marcus cataloged every mark while planning exactly what he'd do to Derek in return. Sarah sat on his couch, and Marcus brought her water and painkillers and waited for her to be ready to talk. She started slowly, telling him about meeting Derek 2 years ago when he'd seemed charming and attentive, about how the control had started small with criticism and isolation before escalating into screaming and shoving and eventually hitting. She tried to leave 4 times, and Derek had found her every time, had convinced her that nobody would help her and nowhere was safe, and she might as well stop fighting because this was her life now. Marcus listened without interrupting while rage built behind his ribs like a living thing. And when Sarah finished talking, she looked at him with those haunted eyes and asked what happens now. Marcus leaned forward and told her very clearly that what happened now was Derek learned what it felt like to be afraid, to not feel safe anywhere, to understand that the person he'd been terrorizing had found someone scarier than him to even the scales. Sarah asked what he meant by that, and Marcus explained in detail what would happen to Derek over the next 72 hours. How his bank accounts would freeze mysteriously. How his employer would receive anonymous tips about illegal activities that may or may not be true. How the police would suddenly take interest in outstanding warrants that had been conveniently overlooked. How every comfort and security Derek took for granted would evaporate like morning fog. Marcus watched Sarah's face as he spoke. Saw fear war with hope war with something that looked almost like satisfaction. And he knew she was finally starting to believe that maybe this nightmare could actually end. She asked if he was going to kill Derek, and Marcus considered the question seriously before saying no. That death was too quick and too merciful for men like Derek. That living in fear was a far better punishment than dying without understanding why. Sarah nodded slowly like she was processing this new reality where someone with actual power had decided to use it on her behalf instead of against her. And Marcus saw the exact moment when something shifted in her expression from victim to survivor. His phone buzzed with a text from his second-in-command saying they'd located Derek at a bar 3 miles away, getting drunk, and telling everyone who'd listened about the woman who'd humiliated him by running away. Marcus read the message and felt cold satisfaction settle into his bones. Told Sarah that Derek was currently making a scene in public, which would make what came next even easier to justify to anyone who asked questions later. Sarah wanted to know what came next, and Marcus told her that right now, what came next was her getting some sleep in a bed where nobody would hurt her, that tomorrow they'd figure out long-term solutions, but tonight she just needed to rest. She looked at him like he'd offered her something impossible, like the concept of sleeping without fear was so foreign she couldn't quite grasp it, and Marcus realized just how thoroughly Derek had destroyed her sense of safety. He showed her the guest room that probably cost more to furnish than Sarah made in a year, told her the door locked from the inside, if that made her feel better, and watch her eyes fill with tears again at this small kindness that shouldn't have been remarkable, but apparently was. Sarah thanked him in a voice that cracked halfway through, and Marcus left her alone, closing the door gently and hearing the lock click immediately after. Marcus returned to his living room and made more phone calls, setting in motion the machinery that would grind Derek into dust over the coming days. He called in favors from judges and cops and business owners, called people who owed him money or loyalty or their lives, and by 2 in the morning Derek's world was already starting to crumble in ways he wouldn't understand until it was far too late to stop. His phone rang at 3 with his surveillance team, reporting that Derek had been kicked out of the bar for starting a fight, that he'd driven drunk to Sarah's apartment and pounded on her door for 20 minutes screaming threats before neighbors called the police. The cops had arrested Derek for public intoxication and disturbing the peace, and he was currently sitting in a cell, sobering up, and probably plotting revenge that would never materialize. Marcus smiled at that news and made another call to ensure Derek's bail would be set impossibly high, that he'd spend at least 48 hours in lockup thinking about how his life had gone sideways so fast. He checked on Sarah through the guest room door and heard her breathing deep and even actually sleeping for what was probably the first time in months, and something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in his chest at the thought of giving her that gift. Morning came, and Marcus woke early like he always did, made coffee, and checked his messages and learned that Derek's nightmare had continued while he slept. His car had been towed for unpaid parking tickets that had mysteriously appeared in the system overnight. His credit cards had been declined at the jail commissary, and his boss had left a voicemail saying not to bother coming to work because they'd received concerning information about his conduct. Sarah emerged from the guest room looking less broken than she had yesterday, wearing the same borrowed shirt and with her hair pulled back from her bruised face. She asked if she'd really slept through the entire night, and Marcus confirmed she had. Watched her process this information like it was a miracle instead of the basic human right it should have been. He made her breakfast, and they sat at his kitchen island eating scrambled eggs while Marcus explained what had happened to Derek overnight. Sarah listened with wide eyes, asked if this was really happening or if she was going to wake up and find herself still trapped in Derek's apartment. And Marcus promised her this was real, that Derek would never touch her again because Marcus didn't make threats he wasn't willing to follow through on. She asked what she was supposed to do now, where she was supposed to go, how she was supposed to rebuild a life that Derek had systematically destroyed. Marcus told her she could stay here as long as she needed while they figured things out, that he had resources and connections that could help her get back on her feet, and Sarah stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. She wanted to know why he was doing this. Really doing this, because wealthy, powerful men didn't just rescue waitresses without expecting something in return. Marcus set down his coffee and looked at her properly, at this woman who'd had the courage to run when running seemed impossible, who'd thrown herself at a stranger's mercy because anything was better than what she had. And he told her the truth, which was that he'd been watching her in that restaurant for weeks. Sarah's face went through several emotions at once, confusion and fear and something else. And Marcus clarified quickly that he'd been watching her because there was something about the way she moved through the world that caught his attention. She had this strength underneath the fear, this determination to keep going even when everything was terrible. And Marcus had found himself looking forward to his meals at that restaurant, just to see her smile, even when he could tell it was fake. He told her about watching Derek terrorize her yesterday, about the rage he'd felt sitting there unable to intervene, about finishing his meal and walking out thinking he'd find another way to help her from a distance. Sarah asked what changed, and Marcus said she did, that she'd given him permission to get involved by getting in his car, and now he was going to see this through to whatever end she needed. Sarah cried for the third time since meeting him, but these tears felt different, less about trauma and more about relief, about finally having someone on her side who had the power to actually make a difference. Marcus let her cry and made more coffee and checked his phone to find that Derek had made bail somehow and was already violating the restraining order Marcus had filed on Sarah's behalf without her knowledge. Derek had gone back to the restaurant where Sarah worked and caused a scene demanding to know where she was, threatening the staff until the manager called the police. Marcus smiled at this because Derek was making everything so much easier by being exactly as stupid as Marcus had hoped, giving them documentation of harassment and threats that would bury him in legal problems he couldn't escape. He showed Sarah the police report and watched her read about Derek's meltdown with something like vindication in her eyes, and Marcus saw her starting to believe that maybe this really was over, that maybe she really was free. She asked what happened next, and Marcus said what happened next was Derek learning that the justice system suddenly cared about his behavior now, that someone with influence was paying attention. Over the next week, Sarah stayed in Marcus's guest room and slowly came back to life in ways that were heartbreaking to witness. She stopped flinching when he moved too quickly, stopped apologizing for existing in his space, started smiling in ways that looked genuine instead of performative. Marcus found himself rearranging his schedule to have breakfast with her, to be there when she woke from nightmares, to make sure she knew she wasn't alone in this. Derek, meanwhile, was spiraling in spectacular fashion, arrested twice more for violating the restraining order, fired from his job for the mysterious allegations that kept surfacing, evicted from his apartment when a landlord suddenly decided he was a liability. Marcus orchestrated every disaster with surgical precision, making sure Derek understood his life was falling apart, but never quite understanding why or how to stop it. Sarah asked one morning if she should feel guilty about what was happening to Derek, and Marcus told her absolutely not. That Derek had spent 2 years making her life a living hell, and now he was experiencing a fraction of that fear and powerlessness. She nodded and said she didn't actually feel guilty. She felt relieved and safe and something else she couldn't quite name. And the way she looked at Marcus when she said that last part made his heart do something it hadn't done in years. He'd been carefully not thinking about how Sarah looked in his shirts or how her laugh sounded when she wasn't performing for customers or how good it felt to come home knowing she'd be there. Marcus had built his life around control and power and keeping people at a distance where they couldn't hurt him. But Sarah was somehow slipping past every defense he'd constructed, and he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her. 2 weeks after Sarah crashed into his car, Marcus's team reported that Derek had left the city, driven to another state in the middle of the night like he was running from something he couldn't see but could definitely feel. The surveillance showed him looking over his shoulder constantly, jumping at shadows, living with the kind of fear he'd inflicted on Sarah for 2 years, and Marcus felt satisfaction that bordered on joy knowing Derek would probably never feel safe again. He told Sarah that Derek was gone and watched her entire body relax like she'd been holding tension for so long she'd forgotten what normal felt like. She hugged Marcus impulsively, and he caught her without thinking, felt her heart racing against his chest, smelled her shampoo, and felt her warmth, and realized with absolute certainty that he was falling for this woman he'd rescued. Sarah pulled back and looked up at him with those eyes that had seen too much but were starting to hope again. And Marcus saw his own feelings reflected back at him. She said his name like a question, and he answered by kissing her, gentle and careful, because she'd been hurt enough for one lifetime. And Sarah kissed him back like he was air and she'd been drowning. They broke apart, and Sarah was breathing hard, her hands still gripping Marcus's shirt like she was afraid to let go. And Marcus could see 1,000 emotions warring across her face, trying to reconcile the man who destroyed her abuser with the man who was kissing her like she was something precious. She asked if this was a good idea, and Marcus said probably not, but he was done pretending he didn't feel what he felt, done acting like having her in his home hadn't become the best part of his day. Sarah laughed, and it sounded almost hysterical, said she'd gone from one dangerous man to another, except this one made her feel safe instead of terrified, and wasn't that just the most messed up thing she could imagine? Marcus pulled her closer and told her he wasn't Derek, that he would never raise a hand to her or control her or make her feel small, and Sarah said she knew that, had known it from the moment he'd driven her away from that restaurant without asking for anything in return. She kissed him again, and this time there was less hesitation and more hunger, like she'd been holding herself back from wanting things and suddenly decided she was allowed to want this. Marcus lifted her onto the kitchen counter, and she wrapped her legs around his waist. And for a few perfect minutes, the world narrowed to just the two of them and the heat building between their bodies and the way she gasped his name against his mouth. His phone buzzed insistently, and Marcus ignored it until it rang. And Sarah pulled back, laughing breathlessly, while he answered with barely controlled irritation. His second-in-command told him they had a situation, that Derek hadn't actually left the city, but had been hiding out planning something, and Marcus felt ice water dump through his veins as he asked what kind of something. Surveillance had picked up Derek meeting with 3 men who had histories of violence for hire, the kind of bottom feeders who do anything for cash and didn't ask questions about legality or morality. Derek had been showing them Sarah's picture and Marcus's address, had apparently scraped together enough money to hire muscle, because he was too much of a coward to handle this himself. Marcus looked at Sarah still sitting on his counter with kiss-swollen lips and messed up hair and felt rage ignite in his chest so intense it was hard to breathe. He tried to be measured about this, tried to destroy Derek systematically without resorting to violence. But Derek had just declared war in the most direct way possible, and Marcus was done playing nice. Sarah saw something change in his expression and asked what was wrong. And Marcus told her honestly that Derek had hired people to come after both of them, that the situation had escalated from harassment to legitimate danger. He watched her face go pale and that old fear creep back in her eyes. And Marcus made a decision that he knew she wouldn't like, but that was necessary. He called his head of security and gave orders that would turn his building into a fortress, armed guards on every entrance, security monitoring every camera, protocols in place that meant nobody got within 100 feet of Sarah without Marcus knowing about it. Sarah listened to him bark commands and realized for the first time exactly how dangerous Marcus actually was not just rich and well-connected, but powerful in ways that made grown men jump to obey. Marcus hung up and pulled Sarah off the counter, told her she needed to stay inside until this was handled, that he had people who would keep her safe while he went to have a conversation with Derek that was long overdue. Sarah grabbed his arm and said absolutely not, that she wasn't going to hide while he went to confront her psychotic ex who'd just hired killers. And Marcus felt something warm bloom in his chest at her, trying to protect him when he'd spent weeks protecting her. He explained very gently that this was what he did, that he'd been handling dangerous men since before she was probably born, and that Derek and his hired thugs were amateurs compared to the real threats Marcus dealt with regularly. Sarah said she didn't care about his experience or his reputation, that she'd already dragged him into her mess and wasn't going to let him get hurt because of her. And Marcus kissed her again, because how could he not when she was being so irrationally brave? He promised he'd be careful and that this would be over by tonight. And Sarah made him swear to come back to her before finally agreeing to stay in the apartment with his security team. Marcus armed himself properly this time. Not just the pistol he usually carried, but additional weapons and body armor, because Derek had made this personal, and stupid people with guns were more dangerous than smart people with knives. His team had tracked Derek to a warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of abandoned building where bad things happened and nobody asked questions. Marcus drove there with 4 of his best men, all of them armed and experienced and loyal in ways that money couldn't buy. And he felt that cold calm settle over him that always came before violence. They approached the warehouse systematically, covering angles and clearing rooms, until they found Derek and his 3 hired thugs in the main space arguing overpayment. Derek wanted them to move tonight, and the thugs wanted more money up front. And nobody noticed Marcus's team surrounding them until it was far too late to matter. Marcus stepped into the light and watched Derek's face cycle through recognition to fear to defiance. And the 3 thugs reached for weapons that Marcus's men already had trained on them. He told everyone very calmly to put their guns on the ground and step away, and Derek's hired muscle took one look at the professional killers surrounding them and decided this job wasn't worth dying for. Derek screamed at them not to abandon him, but the 3 men were already backing toward the exit with their hands up, and then it was just Derek standing alone in a warehouse facing the man who'd systematically destroyed his life. Marcus asked his team to give them privacy, and they melted back into the shadows, still close enough to intervene, but far enough that Derek might actually believe he had a chance. Derek started ranting about how Sarah was his, that Marcus had no right to take what belonged to him, that he was going to make both of them pay for humiliating him. Marcus listened to this pathetic display and felt nothing but contempt for this small man who thought ownership and abuse were the same as love, who couldn't conceive that Sarah had left because she'd found someone who treated her like a human being. He asked Derek if he understood why his life had fallen apart so spectacularly, and Derek said of course he understood, that Marcus had used money and connections to destroy him out of jealousy. Marcus laughed and said no. Derek's life fell apart because he'd terrorized someone who got lucky enough to escape into the car of someone more dangerous than him. And now Derek was learning what real fear felt like. Derek lunged at Marcus with a knife that appeared from nowhere, and Marcus moved on pure instinct, disarming him in 2 efficient movements and putting Derek on the ground with a broken wrist. Derek screamed, and Marcus knelt beside him, explaining very clearly that this was over, that Derek would leave the city tonight and never come back, that if Marcus ever heard Derek's name in connection with Sarah again, it would be the last thing Derek ever did. He pressed just hard enough on Derek's broken wrist to make sure the message was received, and Derek sobbed that he understood, that he'd leave and never come back, that he just wanted this to stop. Marcus stood up and told his team to put Derek on a bus to anywhere that wasn't here to make sure he got medical attention for his wrist and have people watching to ensure he stayed gone. Derek was dragged away, still crying, and Marcus felt nothing. No satisfaction or triumph or even relief, just cold assessment that a threat had been neutralized and Sarah was safe. He called her from the warehouse, and she answered on the first ring asking if he was okay, and Marcus said yes, he was fine and on his way home to her. The drive back felt longer than it should have. Marcus replaying the confrontation and wondering if he should have done more or less or something different. But when he walked into his apartment and saw Sarah waiting by the door with worry written all across her face, when she threw herself into his arms and held him like she'd been terrified he wouldn't come back, Marcus knew he'd done exactly what needed to be done. Sarah checked him over for injuries, even though he told her he was fine, her hands running across his chest and arms and face like she needed physical proof he was whole. Marcus caught her hands and kissed her palms and told her it was over, that Derek was gone for good this time, that she never had to be afraid again. She asked what he'd done to Derek, and Marcus said he'd had a conversation and Derek had seen reason, and Sarah was smart enough not to ask for details she probably didn't want. Instead, she kissed him with desperate intensity, and Marcus picked her up and carried her to his bedroom this time instead of the guest room, because they were done pretending this was temporary or that Sarah was just someone he was helping. They made love like people who'd almost lost each other, urgent and intense and achingly tender by turns. And afterward, Sarah lay against Marcus's chest and said she was falling in love with him. Marcus felt his heart stutter because he'd spent years building walls around himself, and this woman had demolished every single one in less than a month. He told her he'd fallen for her the first time he saw her smile in that restaurant, that he'd spent weeks watching her and wishing he had an excuse to talk to her, that having her crash into his car had felt like fate handing him exactly what he wanted. Sarah laughed and cried at the same time and said only she would find her soulmate by running away from her abuser directly into a Mafia boss's Mercedes. Marcus held her close and thought about how his life had been empty in ways he hadn't even recognized until Sarah filled spaces he didn't know were hollow, and he promised her that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted trusting him. Sarah said she could never regret the best decision she'd ever made, and Marcus kissed her like he could seal that promise between them. His phone buzzed with confirmation that Derek was on a bus heading east and wouldn't be returning, and Marcus finally let himself relax knowing the threat was genuinely over. Sarah was already falling asleep against him, safe and warm, and as in ways that terrified and thrilled him equally. And Marcus decided that maybe love was worth the risk of letting someone past his defenses. 3 months passed, and Sarah's bruises faded to nothing, but her transformation went deeper than skin. She moved through Marcus's penthouse like she belonged there, because she did, laughing freely and sleeping through entire nights, and slowly remembering who she'd been before Derek tried to break her. Marcus watched her bloom back into herself, and felt pride and love, and something fiercely protective that made him understand why men started wars over women they loved. She'd gotten a job in an upscale restaurant that Marcus definitely didn't own, but had strong connections to, working as a floor manager instead of waitress because she'd proven she could handle difficult customers and high-pressure situations with grace. The owner had taken one look at Sarah's resume and Marcus's subtle recommendation and hired her on the spot, and Sarah had thrown herself into the work with enthusiasm that made Marcus fall even harder for her determination. They'd settled into a rhythm that felt domestic and permanent. Mornings spent drinking coffee and reading the news, evenings cooking together in Marcus's massive kitchen, nights tangled in sheets that cost more than Sarah used to make in a month, but she'd stopped feeling guilty about that. Marcus had been teaching her that accepting good things didn't make her weak or dependent, that letting someone take care of her after years of survival mode was actually brave. Derek had stayed gone like Marcus knew he would, the occasional surveillance report confirming he'd found work in some nowhere town 3 states away and was keeping his head down. Marcus had people watching still because trust was earned, not given, but Derek seemed to have finally learned that some fights weren't worth fighting and some women weren't worth dying over. Then one Tuesday evening, Sarah came home from work looking shaken in a way Marcus hadn't seen since those first terrifying days, and he was across the room in seconds, asking what happened. She told him that Derek's mother had come into the restaurant asking to speak with her, that the older woman had been crying and desperate, begging Sarah to drop the charges and give Derek another chance because he was her only son and he'd made mistakes, but he could change. Marcus felt rage ignite, but Sarah grabbed his hand and said she'd handled it, that she told Derek's mother very calmly that her son had broken Sarah's ribs and given her concussions and terrorized her for 2 years while his mother did nothing. She'd said that Derek's chance to change had been every single time he chose to hit her instead, and that she hoped his mother would find peace, but Sarah had finally found hers and wouldn't sacrifice it for Derek's redemption arc. Marcus pulled her close and asked if she was okay, and Sarah said yes. That actually it had felt good to say those things out loud to someone who'd enabled Derek's behavior by making excuses for him. She said she was done being the victim in her own story, done letting Derek and his family make her feel guilty for surviving. And Marcus had never been more attracted to anyone in his entire life than he was to Sarah in that moment of absolute strength. He asked if Derek's mother had caused a scene, and Sarah laughed, saying the woman had cried harder and left defeated. And the restaurant owner had come over afterward to make sure Sarah was all right and to ban Derek's entire family from the premises. Marcus made a mental note to send the owner a very generous gift basket because protecting Sarah was apparently a team effort now. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep, kept thinking about Derek's mother showing up and what that meant, whether Derek knew about it or if this was his mother's desperate attempt to fix her broken son. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and called his security team, told them to increase surveillance on Derek and his family because this felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. His instincts proved correct 3 days later when Derek was spotted at a bus station buying a ticket back to the city. And Marcus's team reported that Derek looked worse than when he'd left, thinner and more desperate with that manic energy that came from obsession unchecked by reason. Marcus made the call to intercept Derek before he got anywhere near Sarah, had his people pick him up from the bus station and bring him to a location where they could have a final conversation. Derek arrived at the warehouse bound and terrified, and Marcus dismissed his security team because this needed to be settled between just the two of them once and for all. He cut Derek's restraints and stepped back, told him very calmly that he got one chance to explain why he'd come back after being warned what would happen if he returned. Derek started ranting about how he loved Sarah, that she was his soulmate, that Marcus had stolen her and ruined his life, and he just wanted her back so they could fix things. Marcus listened to this delusional garbage and understood with absolute clarity that Derek would never stop, would never accept that Sarah had chosen freedom over him, would keep coming back until someone made him stop permanently. He asked Derek if he understood that Sarah didn't want to be fixed, didn't want to be with him, that the relationship was over and had been toxic and abusive from start. Derek said Marcus had poisoned her against him, that Sarah loved him really, that she just needed to remember how good things had been in the beginning. Marcus felt something cold and final settle in his chest as he realized Derek wasn't capable of change or growth or even basic reality, that this man would haunt Sarah forever unless Marcus did what he'd been avoiding doing since the moment Sarah crashed into his car. He told Derek that he'd tried to be merciful, had tried to solve this problem without violence, but Derek had forced his hand by coming back. Derek's face went white as he finally understood what Marcus was saying, and he started begging and promising and swearing he'd leave for good this time. Marcus said he'd heard those promises before, and they meant nothing from a man who'd broken every promise he'd ever made to Sarah, and Derek collapsed to his knees crying that he'd made mistakes, but he didn't deserve to die. Marcus looked at this pathetic broken man and thought about Sarah's bruises and her nightmares and the 2 years of her life that Derek had stolen, and he felt no mercy at all. He told Derek that he was right, that Derek didn't deserve to die, that death was too easy for men who terrorized women they claimed to love, and Derek looked up with desperate hope. Instead, Marcus explained what was going to happen, how Derek would sign legal documents transferring any claim he had on Sarah, how he'd submit to a psychiatric evaluation that would result in mandatory treatment, how he'd wear a monitoring device that would alert authorities if he ever came within 500 miles of the city. Derek protested that this was illegal, and Marcus laughed, saying that legality was negotiable when you had the right connections, and Derek could either accept these terms or Marcus would let his team convince him. 2 of Marcus's men appeared from the shadows, and Derek agreed, frantically, to everything, signed every document put in front of him without reading, submitted to the ankle monitor like a convict accepting parole. Marcus watched it all with cold satisfaction, knowing that Derek's life would now be permanently monitored and controlled the way Derek had tried to control Sarah, that he'd live in a cage even if the bars weren't visible. They released Derek at a psychiatric facility 6 states away, where he'd undergo treatment whether he wanted it or not. And Marcus received confirmation that Derek had been admitted and placed under observation that would last months, if not years. The threat was finally neutralized in a way that didn't require violence, but ensured Derek would never be free to hurt anyone again. Marcus drove home as the sun was rising and found Sarah in the kitchen making coffee. And when she saw his face, she knew without asking that something had changed. He told her everything about Derek coming back and the conversation in the warehouse and the final solution they'd implemented, and Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. She asked if this made her a bad person for feeling relief that Derek was locked away, and Marcus pulled her into his arms and told her it made her human. That relief was the natural response to finally being safe from someone who tried to destroy her. Sarah sobbed against his chest and said she'd been so afraid that Derek would never stop coming after her, that she'd never really be free, and Marcus promised her that fear was over now. They stood in the kitchen holding each other while coffee grew cold and the city woke up outside, and Sarah said she wanted to move forward with her life, wanted to stop looking over her shoulder, wanted to just be happy with Marcus without Derek's ghost hanging over them. Marcus said that was exactly what they were going to do, that Derek had taken enough from her and wouldn't take another day. 6 months later, Marcus and Sarah were married in a small ceremony with only their closest people present, and Sarah wore a dress that cost a fortune and smiled like the sun had come out after years of storms. Marcus watched her walk toward him and thought about the terrified woman who'd crashed into his car begging for help, and marveled at how far she'd come, how strong she'd always been even when fear tried to convince her otherwise. They honeymooned in Europe for 3 weeks, and Sarah discovered she loved traveling and trying new foods and being somewhere Derek had never been, creating memories that belonged only to them. Marcus watched her photograph everything with childlike joy and felt grateful every day that she'd chosen his car, his help, his life to crash into. When they returned home, Sarah started volunteering at a women's shelter, helping other abuse survivors navigate the impossible task of leaving dangerous relationships. And Marcus funded the organization anonymously, while Sarah gave them something money couldn't buy, which was hope and understanding from someone who'd survived. She told her story to women who thought escape was impossible and showed them her life now as proof that it got better, that safety and happiness existed on the other side of fear. Marcus expanded his legitimate business interests and slowly transitioned away from the criminal empire he'd built. Not because Sarah asked him to, but because having her in his life made him want to be someone she could be proud of in daylight, not just behind closed doors. His associates thought he'd gone soft, but Marcus didn't care what they thought anymore. Cared only about building a life with Sarah that wasn't shadowed by violence and moral compromise. Derek remained in treatment, monitored and controlled, and no longer a threat to anyone. And the reports Marcus received quarterly confirmed that Derek was making progress understanding his actions had been abusive, even if real change seemed unlikely. Marcus didn't care if Derek changed or grew or learned anything. Cared only that he stayed away from Sarah and let her live in peace. Years passed, and Marcus and Sarah built a life that neither of them had imagined possible, filled with ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they'd both survived things that should have broken them. They had 2 children who grew up knowing their parents' love looked like mutual respect and kindness and never ever violence. And Sarah made sure her daughter understood that Prince Charming wasn't someone who rescued you, but someone who supported you rescuing yourself. Marcus would sometimes think about that day in the restaurant when he'd watched Sarah being terrorized and wished for a reason to intervene, about how the universe had handed him exactly what he wanted when Sarah threw herself into his car. He'd been trying to fill the emptiness in his life with power and money and control. But Sarah had shown him that what he actually needed was someone to protect and cherish and build something good with. On their 10th anniversary, Marcus took Sarah back to that same restaurant where they'd first connected, and they sat at the table where he'd watch her work and wished he could help. The restaurant had changed ownership and been renovated, but the booth was the same, and Sarah squeezed his hand and said she still couldn't believe that running away from Derek had led her straight to the love of her life. Marcus said he'd been waiting for her without knowing it, that every choice he'd made and every wrong turn he'd taken had been leading him to that parking lot on that specific day when a terrified waitress would need exactly what he could provide. Sarah laughed and said they were either the luckiest people alive or fate had a twisted sense of humor. And Marcus said maybe both could be true. They ordered dessert and talked about their children and their plans and all the ordinary beautiful things that made up a life worth living. And Marcus thought about how violence and power and fear had defined him for so long until Sarah had crashed in his world and shown him that protection could be about building up instead of tearing down. He'd spent decades being dangerous, and now he got to spend the rest of his life being dangerous only to people who threatened what he loved. Sarah caught him staring and asked what he was thinking. And Marcus told her he was thinking about how getting involved in her mess had been the best decision he'd ever made. She said his mess now too, that they'd built this life together from the wreckage of their separate painful pasts, and that made it worth every scar and nightmare they'd both carried. The waitress brought their check, and Sarah left an enormous tip because she remembered what it was like to survive on wages that barely covered rent, remembered working herself exhausted for customers who barely saw her as human. Marcus watched her and fell in love all over again with this woman who'd been beaten down but never broken, who'd had the courage to run when running seemed impossible. They drove home through streets that used to feel dangerous, but now just felt like the city where they'd built their life. And Sarah rested her hand on Marcus's thigh while humming along to the radio. Marcus thought about Derek locked away in his monitored existence and felt no guilt. Thought about all the women Sarah had helped escape their own abusers and felt pride. Thought about his children sleeping safely at home and felt peace. Sometimes the best revenge was living well, was building something beautiful from the ashes of trauma, was proving that abusers didn't get to win just because they were cruel. Sarah had survived Derek and found Marcus and created a life worth fighting for. And that was worth more than any violence Marcus could have inflicted in her name. Sarah escaped her abusive ex and found not just safety, but love with someone who showed her that power could be used to protect instead of control. Sometimes the universe puts exactly the right person in your path exactly when you need them, and having the courage to reach for help can change everything. The strongest thing any of us can do is survive and then choose to thrive despite everything that try to break us. My grandmother escaped an abusive marriage with nothing but her children and her courage. And she made me promise to tell stories that show women they can survive and build beautiful lives after trauma. If share it with someone who needs to hear that escape is possible. Courage to leave. Next week's story will remind you